Hi there, how are you doing? Now in this video you're going to learn about function methods. Okay, so in JavaScript the functions, they have certain methods available to use. So they are apply, call and bind. So apply and call are pretty much similar and bind is a bit different. So we're going to cover them, all of them here. So beginning with apply. So what it does, the apply method accepts two arguments. Okay, it takes two arguments, and let me show you by demonstration, and then it makes perfect sense. Okay, so let's create a function which will sum two numbers. Okay, simple function, because all we want is to get the the proper understanding, so num2. Okay, so two arguments, and then what it does, it returns the total, num1 plus num2. Sum function which takes two arguments and returns the total, simple function. Now let's create another function calling sum. Okay, let's call it calling sum. So what this function will do is this will also take the arguments, okay, num1, num2. Now what it does, now this function, what it will do is, instead of returning same as this one, because we already have another function that does the sum, so what this function wants to do is, instead of doing the calculation himself, the function itself, what it will do is, it will, instead of summing like this, it will apply. So this function returns the function, another function, and wants to apply certain things. So what it wants to apply? It wants to apply the value of this, which we learned about in the previous lesson. So this means it's its own context. Okay, so its context, it is passing to this function, okay, applying to this function, and then it will pass the arguments as well. Okay, now this arguments, it's not just a random text, it's arguments object, you know that, right? So we have a function that returns the sum, and then we have another function that is calling that function and applying certain things. So what it's applying is, this function is applying its own, this object and this argument. So both of these are functions internal objects. Okay, so it's applying its own this and arguments object. So that's what I was trying to say here. Apply method accepts two arguments, yeah, this and arguments, the two arguments, the value of this, yeah, inside the function, and an array of arguments. So in this case I have just passed the arguments object itself. You can also pass the array. Okay, now we can see that in the next example. Then the second argument may be instance of array. Yeah, we're going to cover that in the next one, but it can also be the arguments object. Yeah, in this case we're using the argument object. So pretty simple. So let's see the output, what it does. Console log, and let's log calling sum, and let's pass some arguments. Okay, let's see. As you can see, it's 2, so it does the work. Save, refresh. So this is how you can use apply. Okay, one of the function methods available. And I was talking about the arrays. Arrays works in a similar way. For example, you could pass the array, so num1, num2. Okay, and then if you see, let's see, refresh, what? Okay, num1, num2, and as you can see, the output is same. So you can supply either array or the arguments object itself. So this is how you can use apply. Okay, so that was apply method. Now we're going to cover call method, which is almost exactly same. Okay, the call method is similar to apply. The only difference is arguments are passed to it different in this one. So here we passed like so. call, what you do is you pass in the arguments straight away, like so. So num1, num2. So exactly these arguments you pass in here. No arrays, no arguments object, but the exact arguments, named arguments you pass in there. So that is the only difference between apply and call. So we use the call. Right? So let's see how it works. Refresh, as you can see, it behaves the similar way. Okay, so that's now function apply and call. Now let's cover bind as well. Okay, so let's cover bind as well. So bind method creates a new function instantiating a new function whose this value is bound to the value that was passed into bind method. Okay, so it can get confusing, I understand. Let me show you by example and it will make perfect sense. First, let's create a variable color in a global context in a window object. Okay, color equals, let's say, red. And then same as this is same example as we did before. So variable object equals, let's create a new object and give it a color property and let's name it blue. Okay, so we have two execution contexts. One is global, one is this object's own context. Okay, now I create a function, anonymous function, say, and this will say, let's say, alert this color. Okay, so now this function is operating in a global context, so when it says this color, it will point to the window color. We know that. Say color equals to say color dot, now I want to use the bind method. Okay, so what I'm going to bind is, I want to bind this object. Okay, so global execute context, we have the color properties, variable object, it has color property, it has its own context, and we have a function. This is a method. Okay, now I want to bind this method because by default it is bound, it is in the global execution context into the window object. But what I want to do is, I want to bind this to a different context. For example, in this case, I want to bind this function to this object's context. So what I can do is simply create a new variable, call this method, okay, call this function and apply this method, bind method. So call the function and bind the method to whatever we want. In this case, we want to bind to this object. Okay, now let's say object say color like this. Okay, so let's see, blue. Okay, so instead of red it becomes blue because now it is bound to this object's context. That's why it is blue. If it was, let's say, if I didn't use the bind, okay, so object say color is say color of this function, and then I execute this, invoke this function, what happens? It's red. So when you use bind, it binds to whatever you specify here. Okay, so that's great. You're learning a lot about functions. In the next section, we're going to learn about the primitive wrapper types. Okay, I'll see you in the next section. Thank you.